Great. Well, it's 9 o'clock, so I will get us started here. Hello, my name is Madison Muxworthy. I work for the Yampa Valley Sustainability Council as the Soil, Moisture, Water, and Snow Program Manager, and have been a steering committee member for the Yampa Basin Rendezvous for 2 years now. So it is my sincere pleasure and honor to welcome you to the 2021 Yampa Basin Rendezvous. Today, we're going to be focusing on a dialogue surrounding drought, water availability, and conservation. As you're settling in, please comment in the chat with your name, affiliation, and sector that you work in, if applicable, so that we can get a better sense of who we have joining us today. Thank you to Hugh Kerry for allowing us to use this photo here of the Yampa River near Maybell in July of this summer. I would like to quickly go over today's Zoom meeting format in our next slide. The meeting is being recorded, as you may see. The recording will be uploaded to our website, yvsc.org. If you missed last year's conference, the recordings can be found there. Next, you have been muted upon entry into the meeting. Please remain muted unless you're speaking a question. You also have control over whether you share your video or not. We're also encouraging you to use the chat function throughout the webinar. If you would like to speak your question, please click the raised hand. And in our next slide, you'll see the icon there, and we'll call on you during the discussion to ask your question live. If you're on the phone, press *9 to engage in Q&A. We would also like to point out that in the upper right-hand side, you can change whose video you're seeing and how it appears on your screen. And so that is in the viewfinder in the upper right corner of your screen. Next, we would like to take a moment to thank our steering committee, Marty, Anna, Kent, Nathan, Matt, Sarah, Lindsay, Tony, Jill, and Holly. This committee brings the Yampa Basin Rendezvous mission to life, and we're very appreciative for that. Next, we would like to also recognize our partners. The collaboration that comes about from the Rendezvous is something that we truly value and is made through with these partnerships. Next, we would like to give a special welcome to all the students in attendance at today's conference, including those who are enrolled in the Soil, Moisture, Precipitation, and Streamflow class. Welcome, we're glad you're here. Next, if you live in the Yampa Valley, we encourage you to check out the Pine Moon Art Gallery during the month of September. Jill Bergman, local artist and steering committee member of this workshop, has organized this exhibit, and it is focused on sandhill cranes and the Yampa River. We highly recommend checking it out. Also, Jill Bergman and Friends of the Yampa have partnered to create a community art program. More information can be found on the Friends of the Yampa website. Next, it is my sincere pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. J.C. Norling. J.C. is the VP and Campus Dean of Colorado Mountain College, Steamboat Springs. J.C. will be introducing Dr. Kerry Besnett Hauser. Welcome, J.C., and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madison. Appreciate that. Welcome everyone again to the Yampa Basin Rendezvous. Colorado Mountain College Steamboat Springs campus is honored to host the conference. We look forward to being able to do this event in person next year. Doing the event on Zoom keeps this event consistent as a yearly event, and I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. Reading through the YBR program, I'm impressed with the high caliber of the speakers today and the relevant topics selected. The partnerships required to pull this together is incredible. And I'd like to, again, thank the steering committee and all the partners. I've been asked to introduce Dr. Kerry Besnett Hauser. Since 2013, Kerry has served as president and CEO of Colorado Mountain College. And previous to CMC, Kerry held leadership roles at the Kauffman Foundation, Metropolitan State University of Denver, and the Daniels Fund. Kerry is currently chair of the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission, a member of the El Pomar Northwest Regional Council, and serves on the Great Outdoors Colorado and Vail Valley Foundation boards of directors. Kerry has also been a longtime member of the American Rivers and has rafted many rivers in the West. In addition to her ability to lead and influence change, she's an amazing hiker. She stood on top of 56 of 58 14ers in Colorado, and she'll clue you in on the specifics, but I believe she needs 2 more that are in Chicago Basin and the San Juan Range, which requires a cog railroad ride and a hike in. Kerry has trekked to Everest Base Camp, Kilimanjaro. She's climbed Kilimanjaro and recently climbed Mount Rainier. And at a personal level, I'm just so impressed with Kerry's efforts to lead the college, but also be involved with outdoor pursuits like she does. That offers her a deep spiritual connection to place and a very real perspective about climate change, melting glaciers, and the issues facing rivers and water resources, which I think she'll talk about next. I'm honored to present Dr. Kerry Hauser.
Okay, thanks, JC. It's a good way to start a morning. So I think Nathan's going to drive a few slides for me. It's good to see everybody again. This is always a treat. It's been fun to be part of this event for the last number of years, and certainly CMC is really proud to be part of it. So I don't know in terms of format if there are questions for me, if they're in the chat. Hopefully Madison or Nathan can just flag those for me when I'm done. I'll try to leave a minute or two for that. But I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry we're not in person. Hopefully we will get back to in person soon. I also just want to thank all the organizers and the entire steering committee. And then there also are those that just steer me. And I appreciate them indeed. And those include Nathan Stewart, Matt Jost, JC Norling, Kent Vertrees, and a number of others that are affiliated with CMC. So thank you so much, and certainly to all the steering committee members. So next slide. A number of you are familiar with CMC, but I always find it to be at least worth a minute to talk a little bit about our institution and sort of our evolution. And so it might set the stage a little bit too. So we're a relatively young institution, about 55 years young. And we were founded by a group of very thoughtful citizens who essentially said, if we don't create a college that will serve these resort or these high mountain communities, hard to get to, there weren't many resorts at the time, then there won't be post-secondary opportunities. And that's essentially how we were started. And our mission remains that way today. Our programs are directly tied to the mountain resort region and the economies that make these communities thrive. Early on, as you can see from the photos, we offered programs in mining and farm and ranch management. You wouldn't be surprised at all those things. And certainly we're going to touch on a lot of those topics later and how those have changed and been impacted by drought and over subscription of our river basins. And we have certainly, as JC mentioned, we're an early provider of outdoor education programs, and we still offer those decades later. Next slide. So now I always sort of like to show this map that the sort of green and yellow are CMC's footprint, and the entire sort of white box is Colorado. So we cover a really big chunk of the state of Colorado as our quote service area. Our original 2 campuses were Leadville and Glenwood Springs. We now have 11 locations. That graphic that you see there covers 12,000 square miles, 9 counties. It's the equivalent of the state of Maryland. It includes dozens of mountain passes, many that we have to drive over or try to drive over in normal times, 18 ski resorts, 24 of those 14,000 foot mountains. And yes, I have 2 to finish. Someday I'm going to get back in there and finish. 15 wilderness areas and millions of acres of national forest. And over our tenure as an institution, we've served over 500,000 students. So today, next slide, CMC is considered a comprehensive dual mission institution, meaning that we offer both liberal arts programs, science certificates and associate degrees, specialized certificates, and a range of bachelor's degrees. We obviously do lifelong learning as well. And our specialty programs that are somewhat germane today are in sustainability studies. We have a lot of students, I would imagine, on today, hopefully, ecosystem science and management, outdoor recreation leadership, ski area operations, you can see there down in the lower left, and a unique hands-on program that I think we're all very proud of. Nathan and others are very involved with, the Rocky Mountain Land Management Program, which is really a neat hands-on apprentice program. Next slide. Also important, I think, is to highlight how connected CMC and our region is to rivers and the broader Colorado River Basin, which obviously includes the Yampa. And a few years ago, some of you have heard this story, but I always find it's fun to re-mention. When I was contemplating service on the American Rivers National Board, I had to kind of make the connection to how am I going to use CMC time to serve on a board that I just care about personally because I love rivers. And so I asked a couple of work studies students in my office to count the number of rivers that run through that map that I showed you a little bit earlier, our sort of geographic footprint. So they went to work, came back, thought it was sort of a simple exercise and reported back to me and said 8 rivers. I kind of giggled to myself because I look out my window and I can see the confluence of the Roaring Fork and the Colorado right outside my window. And I know there are more rivers than that, plenty more rivers. So I asked them to go back and try again. So they did it. They really took it seriously this time. And so by their count, second time's a charm. Next slide. CMC is home to 9 major rivers, 16 secondary rivers, however that's defined, 21 major creeks, and 400 other unique creeks and streams. I think that's pretty phenomenal. And obviously, we've got the headwaters of the Arkansas and some really cool stuff going on. So we are sort of naturally linked to rivers. And so not only is the Yampa an outdoor classroom and lab for our faculty and students at our Steamboat campus, but our Leadville campus sits at the headwaters of the Arkansas, where our natural resources students study fen and meadow restoration, water quality, river orientation, and other subjects. The frying pan, the eagle, the blue, the elk, the white, the Williams Fork, crystal, and others are prominent in our daily lives. For those of us who live here, we probably say, I live in the Roaring Fork Valley. I live in the Yampa River Valley. It's very much part of our identity. Next slide. And some of you know that I have a very close personal love for this place. I was born in Flagstaff, Arizona, grew up about 90 minutes from the Grand Canyon, and I grew up hiking this big ditch with my dad, and we would pick new trails to the river as often as we could and sort of check them off, sort of like 14,000 foot peaks. So when I was growing up, I would hike down first and up last. And in Colorado, you go up first and down last, right? So it just switched the orientation. But I will tell you, I was absolutely hooked at a very, very young age. And I vowed to somehow figure out how to work in this incredible place sometime down in my lifetime. So a few volunteer trips later and a lot of pestering with a company that's based in Northern Arizona, I became a swamper with Hatch River Expeditions, which was the original big commercial rafting company in the Grand Canyon. They're actually they were originally based out of Vernal, Utah. And I did that for about a dozen summers ago, in and out of grad school and sort of quote real jobs. And it was something that I will say, truly people ask me what was my best training to become a college president. And I will say very genuinely, it was being a swamper in the Grand Canyon. We can talk more about that someday if you like. So fell in absolute love with this place and became very keenly familiar with how fragile the river running through it is. And I also developed a very mixed emotion about the 2 big concrete plugs at either end of the Grand Canyon, the Glen Canyon and the Hoover Dams, and their corresponding reservoirs, which, as we all know right now, are at very serious risk. And somehow, some way, however many years ago, we thought that wasn't inevitable. Really, I mean, I think we are just sort of experiencing destiny. And as we all know, for the first time ever, the Colorado River water shortage has been officially declared. And if you're following the news about Blue Mesa Reservoir and other reservoirs that are having calls, it's really serious. So I think it is a wake-up call for all of us. Next slide, Nathan. So the term drought, I think for a lot of people sort of implies a temporary state. But most scientists right now believe that this is sort of our new normal, and this is what we have to grapple with. Can we go backwards? Probably not. Can we prevent further damage and sort of deterioration of our river basins and this sort of severe drought? I hope we can, and I certainly hope that the conversations today will lead to that. And much of the region that CMC calls home has been in moderate to extreme drought for many, many years. Next slide. So I was asked to make this a little bit personal. So I have a couple little personal things that I will share with you to hopefully contextualize the conversations today. And obviously the results have been the worst wildfires ever. And if you talk to forest managers, they will tell you that this is absolutely, they're used to sort of summer, fire seasons, but hundreds of thousands of millions of acres is nothing like they've ever seen before. And it is now becoming commonplace. So these photos are from August of last year. The first one on the left is actually from my office. And that is the Grizzly Creek fire breaking out in Glenwood Canyon. That was about 1:30 p.m. on August 10th. And we literally watched that from a conference room in my office break out. Interestingly, a rafting company coming along was being led by the son of somebody that works in my office. And he called mom and said, we're getting out of Glenwood Canyon. There's a big fire. So this is the Grizzly Creek fire. The upper right-hand photograph is literally taken from our house that evening. It burned so quickly and so fast. It was really scary for those of us who experienced this. And this was not the only fire, obviously, that was happening last year. And then the lower right is sort of the remnants of Glenwood Canyon. And this is sort of near the Blue Mesa, the Blue Gulch drainage, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. So we braced this summer for much of the same, and it started out that way. For those of you up in the sort of Routt County, there were fires up there, the Sylvan Lake fire near our Vail Valley campus, obviously, and others around the state. And then in July, what happened? It started to rain. Next slide. It dumped quickly and heavily, and it was amplified by many burn scars in our region. And these photos, I had an opportunity about a month ago to tour Glenwood Canyon with Senator Besnett and some CDOT officials and some folks from the Corps of Engineers. I know you have a speaker from the Corps of Engineers on the docket, but this is some of the initial damage to the interstate that was caused by this flooding and these mudslides. And you can see the holes there. I mean, you can see the person in the right-hand photograph just to get an idea. And I would also just flag for you the debris in the river. And we'll come back to that because a lot of the attention has been on the interstate, rightfully so, for commerce and everything else. But if you'll go to the next slide, Nathan, the damage to the river has been extensive. And these pictures don't even do it justice. Walking along the side of that interstate and seeing these, and this is what Mother Nature does. This was a 500-year event, and this is how alluvial fans are created. This is how rapids are created. We know that this is how it happens, and this wouldn't have happened without such severe drought, and obviously the state of the burn scars. I've been told now that this would have happened anyway. Regardless of the burn scars in Glenwood Canyon, there would have been a lot of flooding. Certainly those burn scars didn't help. It was 2 inches of rain in 1 hour in that Blue Gulch drainage. And this is what it caused. And there were, I don't know, 40 slides or something along Glenwood Canyon in this particular time frame. And it was as if water was hitting concrete. That's how fast it came down, and that's what it pulled down. So it really is pretty phenomenal. So just kind of take that into the extremes are getting more extreme, and hopefully we'll have opportunity to have those conversations. So JC mentioned, next slide, this is totally kind of a little bit non-tangential, but I know we have some Californians and we have some others on the line. But this was just really recently. This was in July, a little bit of a tangential note, and not to forget, obviously, our Pacific Northwest, where those fires are still coming in. I woke up this morning, probably you did too, very hazy skies, all that. Those fires are still burning, obviously, big in California and the Pacific Northwest. And I did have an opportunity to climb Mount Rainier this summer with one of our amazing faculty members, and some of our faculty have heard me talk a little bit more about this. But I would just say that I've showed these photographs who have Rainier experience, and they look at particularly the upper left slide, and they don't even recognize the mountain because the glaciers have melted so fast, so extremely. And I will say, on our way down, it was 80 degrees at 10,000 feet. And it felt like a mirror, like walking on a mirror. And we were literally watching the ice and the snow melt all around us. So pretty remarkable. Next slide. So then just a couple of things to kind of bring it back home, obviously. Next slide, Nathan. And that is that obviously for the Yampa River Valley, lower snowpacks totals and a disappearing monsoon season has almost eradicated the mud season, which obviously helps mitigate fire. And this has had a large impact on aquatic life in the river, and it has led for calls to curtail water usage on the Yampa River in 2018. That was the first time ever. And again, in 2020, the rivers are so low. JC mentioned that I currently chair the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. We've had to prohibit fishing on various rivers because the flow is so low and the water is so warm. It's endangering our native species. Water restrictions and low levels have such deep impact on agriculture. Obviously, which rely on these sort of floodlands to help produce hay and other crops. Water covers, as we know, 70% of our planet. It's easy to think that it will always be plentiful. However, that freshwater stuff, all the stuff that we've been talking about today, we drink it, we bathe in it, we irrigate it, it is becoming increasingly scarce, as we know. Some 1.1 billion people worldwide lack access to water, and a total of 2.7 billion find water scarce for at least a month of the year. And at the current consumption rate, this situation will only get worse. By 2025, 2/3 of the world's population may face water shortages, and our ecosystems around the world will suffer as well. So that's a lot of grim news. So let me end on a positive note. Next slide. So what are the good news? And what is CMC doing about this? Obviously, with the help of our amazing faculty and our team at CMC, our students are learning and working to help correct these types of environmental issues. Most basically, we've got, hopefully, again, we have sustainability students on the call today, are being made aware of all these environmental issues through this and other conferences. This is formally part of their curriculum. It leads to thoughtful dialogue about how CMC students reflect and take action to their own learning. Obviously, we've done outdoor education since our inception, and our students are seeing with their own eyes the effect of drought. They're in mountain and desert orientation programs, confronting these issues in real time. Our faculty have made it their teaching philosophy to educate and point out how these environments have changed and how the impact on wildlife and beyond. I mentioned our Rocky Mountain Land Management Program. We also have permaculture courses, a beekeeping club, all examples that are diving straight into these issues. And the college itself obviously is developing a new bachelor's degree in eco-science that will go hands-on into some of these other programs that I've just mentioned. And then finally, I would say that CMC, last slide, has made a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2050. That's an official pledge that we've made. And this was just made the news. This is a major solar project on our Glenwood Springs campus in Spring Valley. And I'll just give you one bit of data. The technology solutions installed will be owned by our partner Ameresco on land that it will lease at our CMC Spring Valley campus, where we have 800 acres available for these types of projects. Ameresco will sell the output generated to Holy Cross Energy. The avoided annual greenhouse gas emissions of the solar PV are expected to be 6,853 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which equates to the emissions benefit of removing almost 1,500 passenger vehicles from the road, or not burning nearly 8 million pounds of coal. So these are the kind of projects, obviously, that we are leaning into, and hopefully they will make a contribution to improvements to the things that I've spoken about before. So I think that's what I was asked to cover, to offer you a little bit of a framework to kick in. I've seen lots of things go into the chat, but I haven't been able to monitor them. So if there's one or two things that you want me to comment on, I'm happy to do that. I'm also happy to give it back to you because I know there's a big, busy schedule today. So Nathan, Madison, you tell me what you'd like me to do.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kerry, so much for your presentation. That was very informative and very timely. So thank you. We do have one quick question that we would love to ask. Dr. Hauser, thank you for your time. Do you see CMC elevating this sustainability view with a SUS VP to aid in policy making in the college?
You know, I get asked this question all the time. Is there a sustainability director? Is there a sustainability coordinator? You know, I think we've thought about it a lot of different ways. And certainly that's one way of going about it. A big part, and I'm sure Tina Evans is on, I went to an ASHE conference with her a number of years ago. A lot of the commitment is reporting. And that's really an analysis function. So we've added capacity to our institutional research division to help us sort of track and manage some of the data. You know, my philosophy has been to try to cross-cut a lot of what we do in sustainability. A lot of it's in our facilities department. A lot of it is data and tracking. So whether or not it's one place where it's coordinated or we have that function split across and decentralized, that's at least been the way that we've approached this so far. There's always opportunities to think differently about that. I'm committed to continuing to think about where we go and what we do. But currently, I would just answer whoever asked the question to say there is a commitment, and it's a number of people across the college who are satisfying that function.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
And one more question. What do you see as a primary reason for hope and action going forward as we continue to live and work in this new normal?
You know, there is obviously that cliche not to let good crises go to waste. And I don't know that we have any better wake up calls than some of the things that we've seen. If you took real note of those photographs of I-70 and those slides, and to be there in person, it's hard to not want to take action and to figure out how each of us does our part individually. And then obviously as an institution, I'm immensely proud of the work that we do, our faculty and our students in the various different areas that touch this. And I also hope that every student that comes through Colorado Mountain College, whether or not they're a nursing student or whatever, get some sense of this incredibly fragile and beautiful place that we live and that we call home, and that we have to be stewards to make sure that it's here for generations to come. So those things make me hopeful, and I'm also really proud of conferences like this and for CMC to be part of them, because it's important that these are not one and dones. It is important that we talk today and that we actually act when we leave, and that we don't leave these conversations behind. So I certainly implore all of you that we have lots of calls to action coming over the next 2 days, and I will certainly stand beside you and do what I can to be part of it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kerry, so much. I really appreciate your presentation and your time. We're going to move on. We have a couple of questions still in the chat, so we'll follow up with you after on those. So thank you, Kerry.
I'll try to answer a few while I'm sitting here. How about that?
Great.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Great. I will now quickly move on to introduce our next panelist. We have Marty Ralph. Marty is the director for the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes, Scripps Institution of Oceanography, UC San Diego. Marty is a research meteorologist and at the forefront of atmospheric storm research, and is focused on understanding the origins of floods and droughts and on improving predictions for water management and flood control applications. He is a leader in development in forecast-informed reservoir operations, working closely with federal, state, and local water managers. Marty has been the vision behind the creation of Yampa Basin Rendezvous and continues to provide ongoing support and direction for the Rendezvous. Marty, we're thrilled to have you here today. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Madison. What an honor to be here and follow Kerry's remarkable presentation. It's amazing to be able to see the agenda we have and the really top-notch experts who are joining us from across disciplines and agencies and perspectives. And it's really what we hoped Yampa Basin Rendezvous would become, as a chance for people to talk with each other across disciplines in ways that we normally haven't had a chance to do, and to engage the community as such. It's disappointing to not be in person. I'm very much an in-person person, and yet the virtual world is part of life now, and I think we've got a very well-organized virtual session here. I just wanted to follow on Kerry's response to the question about hope. And I find in my life, the world has gone in the US from, I saw a bald eagle once or twice before I was 25. Now they've returned. I've seen peregrine falcons frequently. And in fact, the Yampa River was one of their last bastions of natural well-being. And from them have come more across the West and even in urban areas. I lived in LA in the 1980s when you could barely see the mountains normally on a given day. And we all wondered whether that was just, the marine layer haze or whether that was pollution. Well, now, 40 years later, we see the mountains pretty much every day in LA, unless there's an obvious bank of clouds. So when policymakers and science combine to address a challenge, we have a proven track record as a nation, as a people, that we can make a difference. And I believe that's what we're about here. And we're starting this journey with the Yampa Basin Rendezvous at the headwaters of the most important river in the Southwest, the Colorado. And that my belief is the Yampa River is a bellwether of what's going to come and what's happened in the future, or what's happened in the past is a bellwether of what's going to come. And we have a chance here to talk with an amazing array of experts on what's going on. So I want to jump in now to share just a few thoughts, a little bit on where we came from on the Yampa Basin Rendezvous. And it really started as an idea. And for people on the call here, maybe some early career people, This was just an idea, basically over beers one night. And we came up with the name for it, the basic mission for it, had a few meetings. Next thing you know, we've got 4 years down the line, and we've got a wonderful event going on that's really stayed true to its original goal. This was from 2018. I'm going to highlight a few of the images here, not read them through. But one thing you'll see is that we went into the field to do field trips and to meet the Fetcher ranch, Jay Fetcher and the folks at the ranch there, and to visit different, the Carpenter Ranch and other facilities in the region. This is part of what we hope to get back to in person. The next year, once again in person, we had a nice meeting as well, grew it substantially from the year before. These were in early June. Last year, we had one as well, but we had to go virtual. And then it turned into, instead of in person, we ended up with 4 webinars of an hour and a half each. And we had good discussion, great presenters. Sorry for the voice here. Not COVID. This year we were so hopeful to be in person, but of course here we are virtual in a different virtual format. We're going to do it all in 2 days here. And here's the wonderful flyer provided by Maddie Muxworthy and Sarah Jones and company, describing what we're doing this time. And it highlights also the contributors and leaders in the organization of it. I also want to just summarize very briefly. You can see the evolution of what the dialogues have been about. Initially on Western weather, climate, environment, and culture, and appreciate Jill and the emphasis on the art side of the world we live in as human beings. It's part of our lives, and it's a wonderful thing to have that as part of the event. And I appreciate Jill's leadership in that. And the event we had in person a couple of years ago was fantastic. I hope people will look up the stuff online that is available now. Then we looked at climate projections and community resilience, then measuring and managing seasonal variability, and this year, drought, water availability, and conservation. So you can see how we're evolving through and updating the theme according to timely issues. I'd also like to mention that one of our early goals, it was sort of a dream, was that we might end up by doing this, create opportunities for early career folks to gain experience, maybe through some internships. I was able to sponsor some from CW3 at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and Maddie Muxworthy was one of the recipients of that. And this year, and we had wonderful mentors, and Mike Sirks, who's finishing his PhD shortly at UCSD. I'm his advisor, and Michelle Stewart, of course, and Anna Wilson. And this year now we have doubled that. We have 2 interns, both named Rachel. That is not a requirement for future interns. You don't have to be named Rachel. Maybe it's an advantage somehow, I don't know, but you can see the range of advisors as well. So we're really trying to create opportunities for people to gain experience through this effort. Now I just want to turn a bit to the science. One of the things that I found so remarkable as we started the Yampa Basin Rendezvous was this back-to-back years, 2011 and 2012, the wettest year on record and one of the absolute driest. And they were just 1 year apart. This is what climate change experts have been projecting is likely to be more common, swinging from one extreme to the other. That was 2011, 2012. And we started the Center for Western Weather and Water Extremes in 2013. And in 2014, we had one of the driest years, the driest year in record in parts of Northern California, followed 2 or 3 years later by the wettest year on record. This story is being told all across the country now and in parts of the world that we have these extremes. And how do we deal with that? The highway problem in Glenwood Canyon is severe, and the fires are just ravaging the West. I hate to even think about it, and I've seen so much of it personally, I'm sad to say. So these extremes really matter, and that's part of what our center is about exploring. It's part of what the Yampa Basin Rendezvous has highlighted, and I just want to explore that just a moment here technically. This is an example from 2019 of snow water equivalent in the upper Colorado Basin above Lake Powell. And notice that red curve, which was the current year, 2019. And check out, forget those figures on the left real quick. Check out that box on the right. 40% of the seasonal snow water equivalent happened in 2 weeks in late February into March. That made the year go from being semi-normal to really pretty wet. In the relatively recent years, that's a pretty wet year. And that 2-week period really made a difference across all of the upper Colorado Basin. Those of us who are familiar with Steamboat, those who live here and in the Colorado Rockies know that there are a few sort of iconic storms each year, typically that are exciting as skiers, trouble as transportation people, and blessing for next year's water. Well, last year was no different. Here in Steamboat, we had an event it's in the black line there, February. We had 10.6 inches of snow water equivalent increase at the Tower Snowtell site in 2 weeks. Zhenhai Zhang and my group, Dr. Zhang and I have worked on this, sort of tracking it for a couple of years. The 10 lines here or the 11 really, are the wettest events, 2-week periods in 20 years of data from the Tower site. And notice on the right that if you take these top 10 2-week periods, which is 20 weeks total out of 20 years, out of basically 600 weeks of normal snow season, they contributed 2.2 years worth of snowpack. Those extreme events are really important to the long-term climatology. And if we're going to expand this analysis to look at the entire upper Colorado and see how that contributes to the changes in the Lake Powell situation. Well, one of the key storm types that we've been studying is atmospheric rivers. And this is a schematic showing how they come off the ocean. They're really rivers in the sky. Any one AR on average, an average AR transports 25 times the water as the Mississippi River dumps into the Gulf of Mexico, 25 times. There's only 3 or 4 of them in the Northern Hemisphere at any given time. And wherever they are is where the water vapors move in, and there's a chance to create heavy precipitation, which contributes to annual precipitation. In the West Coast, somewhere from a quarter to half of the annual precipitation comes from just a few ARs each year. And whether there's more or fewer ARs really determines whether we're in drought or flood. And we're now researching how well that paradigm applies farther inland, like in this part of the country. And there are certainly some cases where ARs are penetrating here. And I'll show you that right here as an example from, I think this was 2021 or 2020. And you can see that orange blob there, that's the AR. The vectors show the water vapor movement. You can see it heading across Oregon, Washington into Northwest Colorado. And people living here have known for a long time that those Northwest storms can really be big snowmakers. And now we're putting some numbers to those and better understanding of the physics of it. And there's another sketch. Well, is it really only the upper Yampa? I took a look this last winter after that wet period in February here and looked at the Wolf Creek, the other Snowtell, the one not quite as wet as Tower. Tower is super wet. And look at that stair-step nature of that black curve there. These very discrete storms each contributed substantially to the annual total. And I think in the box in the top there, 80% of the SWE to date was contributed by these 5 events in a total of 18 days out of what was probably 100 days of season so far. So these are the snow water providers and the water supply providers for us. Well, let's take a look, a very sobering look at what's going on at Lake Powell right now, and I'll close in just a second. This is 5 years of data from Lake Powell water levels, feet on the left axis, vertical axis, and time here 1 year, but there's 6 different curves shown. That black curve is this year, and look how tragically low it's gone. And if you calculate the difference between the peak year of this several year period was 8 September 2017, 14.8 million acre feet. It's dropped, half of that is gone as of today. That's basically what has kept Lake Mead from going into shortage over the last few years, is that Lake Powell has helped keep it alive. And this year, there's just no way to sustain that. And hence Lake Mead is going to be dropping to the point where water shortage is declared. And that's going to create a whole chain of events that are quite serious, as we all know. I also wanted to highlight the Bureau of Reclamation has a wonderful website to see what's going on in Lake Powell. And here we can see, how low the yellow bar there is basically this year. We're almost done with it. And how remarkably low, basically the second lowest in the last 20 years at least. But notice the average over the 1981 to 2010 period is 10.8 million acre feet. But look at the last 20 years, from 2002 to 2021. I just calculated this morning. Sorry if I got the numbers wrong somewhere, but it seems about right. 8.5 million acre feet. That's a 21% reduction from the previous, that 30-year period of record. 21%. That is an amazing amount of water. For perspective, the entire metropolitan water district deliveries are on the order of 2 or 3 million acre feet per year for 20 million people. So this is a huge chunk of water that is basically gone in the last 20 years, other than those rare above normal events, above past normal. And here's the storylines, in the major newspapers and in the Arizona paper there about the shortage. And one thing that's also now looming is the shortage that's been declared is what's called a tier 1 shortage. But there's another tier lower, tier 2, which is now very much in play for the next year. And this note points out that for Arizona, which is getting hit most hard on the tier 1 shortage, this water provides about 40% of Arizona's water supply. This is a major hit to a major state with agriculture and recreation and urban users really depending on this water. So we're really, I think, reaping now the consequences of this change that we've been seeing over the last 20 years. The buffer that had been in Lake Powell is gone, and now we've got to pay the piper, so to speak. Well, what can we do about it? There's a lot, I think, that can be done. I know water managers are really working hard on this. There's a lot of issues in play politically, water management decision-wise, energy-wise, economically, with all sorts of issues that are being addressed. There's a lot of people working on this. One thing we are thinking about as scientists to try to contribute is to deal with the fact that the snowpack, when it melts, doesn't all end up in the river, right? Some of the snowpack evaporates into the sky when it's windy and dry and sunny, especially in the spring. Some of it goes into the soil and feeds the plants and never gets into the river. That latter bit is a pretty serious drawdown from the snowmelt expectation. So we have initiated a project thanks to the support of Upper Yampa Water Conservation District and in partnership with Yampa Valley Sustainability Council and Colorado Mountain College to install a long-term soil moisture sensor site in the basin somewhere. We're in the very early stages of analyzing where best to do this. And we're envisioning the prospects of growing this network over time because it will help provide, say, 10 years from now, we'll be able to know how much, as we're going into the spring melt, is likely to be absorbed by the soil. Whereas today, we don't have that data very much. And this is one of the things we're hoping to contribute over time. I'll close with that and just say thank you again for the chance to be here and for everybody's participation. Back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Marty. That was a very impactful presentation. We're looking for questions for Marty right now. Feel free to send them through the chat function, or if you'd like to speak your question live, you can go into your reactions and raise hand. And we will also have a larger group Q&A at the end of this portion. And so with that, I will hold for questions for Marty. And Marty, we're looking forward to bringing you back for the larger Q&A. So thank you so much for your presentation. Wonderful. I will now introduce our second panelist, Megan Holcomb. Megan is a senior climate and drought specialist, Colorado Water Conservation Board, Department of Natural Resources for the state of Colorado. She is a hydrologist and drought specialist working in complex political practitioner systems to help communicate what resilience really means in a society. In all roles, she advocates for cooperative, anti-scarcity approaches to water resource management. Megan has served as the state's water supply planning team with the Colorado Water Conservation Board since 2017, providing technical expertise to implement the Colorado Water Plan. She manages the state's Drought Task Force network to help Colorado communities and water economies respond to drought and adapt to climate change. Megan, we're so thrilled to have you presenting today. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? Okay. All right, we'll see how much we can pack into 15 minutes here. I just want to say thank you for organizing this, and it's not even 10 and we've already had some incredible presentations and information. So yes, I work with the Colorado Water Conservation Board, which is a state agency, and my primary role, especially over the last 2 years, has been to coordinate the state's drought response. So that's working with all of our agencies, communities on the ground, in making sure that we have the kind of resources readily available for those that are approaching extreme situations in drought response, and also serve as really a direct pipeline to hear what's happening on the ground and make sure that the state can be as responsive and ready as possible to make sure that we avoid major emergencies, whether that's public health or just ready respond to entire economies that are affected by drought. It's a pretty strange and interesting job. And sometimes I call myself the bad news girl because I come in and give presentations like you are hearing today. So I'm glad I'm not the only bad news girl here, but I also try and make sure the conversations we're having with communities is not, just total doom and gloom, because at this point, in history of climate science, like we are certainly at a place where people are seeing impacts very visibly. Kerry said out her window from her office, there's an understanding I think we've hit at this point, especially in Colorado, where we feel the impacts that we were talking about 20 years ago and anticipating. So that's really a challenging reality to deal with, and it is also reality. So working with our communities and state and neighboring partners, state partners, to make sure that we're responding and preparing as much as we can for the future that is already here. So I'm really going to breeze through some of these things, try and give a very high level overview of the state's drought response structure without getting too nitty gritty. And I will say, I think about drought in Colorado River and all of our rivers here every day. And Kerry, I was really appreciated your presentation, because I have my very first Grand Canyon experience at the end of the month. So that feels like a huge retreat for my soul to be able to spend time with the river and a place that we care and think so much about. So this is 1 week old, but the US Drought Monitor for the entire country really gives the picture of where Colorado is situated in the entire Western drought experience. We happen to be at this eastern edge, which is actually enveloping us around Kansas, but this eastern edge of a very intense, over half of our country drought. And what's interesting here is that Colorado was in 100% drought conditions for over 35 weeks. And we had some spring and summer precipitation that really alleviated the conditions on our eastern slope. So this is called a class change map. And all this does is show you how, based on the US Drought Monitor, how we have either improved or degraded in different classes of drought. So that's D0 to D4. So those are intensity measures of drought. And so you can see here, Colorado is this beautiful green spot. And my message is not like, oh, we're great here. It's actually, we can have improvements in intensity of drought and still feel the lingering effects, right? Drought is we talk about it as this strange natural hazard. There's not a clear start and stop. There's no sort of clear boundary of exactly where a flood or a fire came through and this survived and that didn't. Drought is very diffuse in its impacts, and it does not affect the spots of intensity that you see there on the US map. It does not always reflect, well, that's the only place that's having a problem, right? We can have lingering impacts in our economies and in our communities for water managers with drought, even when we have some actual relief on these maps, which are really just 1 week retroactive accounts. And this is like a log that every week the drought monitor will show us, okay, what was last week's conditions? And so it gives us a record. This is not showing the outlook. And so we had some partners at the Colorado Climate Center piece together those weekly maps for Colorado over the last year and a half. So what you're seeing here in the should loop back is the last, really how drought has moved through Colorado in intensity. So back in 2020, we started to see, we came out of winter already at a deficit from 4 years of missing monsoon seasons. We had relatively low snowpack, but we weren't seeing, relatively average, but we weren't seeing that snowpack translating into stream flows. And what that really showed us and revealed quickly is that we have in Colorado and especially in their southern and western regions, what you'll hear referred to as a soil moisture deficit. So because of the trajectory of a warming climate and all of these years piling up on each other, we have the landscape that's increasingly dry. So even though we might have what's historically an average winter snowpack, that water is not translating into, through our landscapes and into our streams as it used to. So it takes a lot more to rehydrate the land. You can think of that as a dry sponge, right? And it takes more water to get a very crusty sponge back in working condition than a slightly wet sponge. And we're seeing those effects in our forests. We're seeing those effects in wild, major impacts that you'll hear about today and tomorrow. But the message is that we know that this is our direction. We're seeing this in trends long term, and there's certainly conversations around both like mitigation and adaptation to drought. We need to continually adapt to the future that we know is coming while mitigating severe impacts, that we're seeing today. So I have a few graphs here in succession. Don't try and read the small print because that's not the point. But what I'll show you is these are different graphs of Colorado drought history with different measures of drought severity. So the one that's up here now is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. And that really shows us, I'll have to move this. It really shows us significant episodes of drought highlighted by those vertical red bars. So PDSI uses both temperature and precipitation data to measure annual water excess or deficits. And it begins to tell this story of increasing frequency and intensity of drought. So if we look at the standard precipitation index, SPI only, so that considers only precipitation, we see these big periods of wet and dry. The 2018 drought, for example, was short-lived enough that in terms of precip, it doesn't really even show up in this perspective. But if you add the effects of warmth, temperature, it shows us this essentially 20-year straight drought that we've been in. These graphs actually look worse if you isolate the west slope only. So unlike the standard precipitation index, the SPEI captures the main impacts of increased temperatures on water demand. And so that's where we get to the soil moisture story. When we talk about warming temperatures, and that is a very clear direction we're going, we have higher evaporative demands in our ecosystem. So higher evaporative loss from soil, higher evapotranspiration, sorry, can't speak yet this morning. So that means vegetation stress. So our plant communities are working harder when it's hotter, and that means that they're also transpiring more. And so you just, in addition to having these soil moisture deficits, you also have our ecosystems working harder because of higher temperatures. So that's also contributing to this gap in based on the precipitation we get each winter, what actually shows up in our streams. So something to keep in mind when we think about the whole ecosystems challenge here. So this is Colorado statewide back to 1900s of temperature anomalies. So that's in respect to a 100-year average. And you can see here the direction we're heading and why when we pull in those SPEI maps that include temperature, why you really then get to see the picture of how the state has been experiencing drought as more of a long-term rather than just like cyclical events. So moving on to how our state manages this particular hazard, it is considered drought is considered a natural hazard like fires, flood, hurricanes, but it is a bit of an anomaly in that it is also the, it's not one weather event. It is long-term trends, and it is also it is the result of an entire global change that we're seeing. And we have a plan, it was last updated in 2018, to help the state coordinate our response that covers monitoring, assessment, response, and mitigation. And so there's a task force, you're going to hear that word a lot because we have 5 of them. But the Water Availability Task Force is a team of climate specialists. We have a Colorado Climate Center, NRCS, lots of water providers from throughout the state that call in every month to this public meeting. Anyone can access this meeting and they get an update of current conditions and near-term outlook. So that's our check-in, that's our monitoring every single month of where the state is at as a whole. And we look at each basin and then we look at state, state data as a whole. So that's a really good place to have, if you're curious of conditions, a place to call in. We have all of those recorded in a monthly summary that goes out as well. So the other sections of the state drought plan really gives us a basis for how we assess drought conditions. And then Annex A, the drought response plan there is my guide. That's my guide as a water professional for how to coordinate drought response. And that's what I've been using over the last 2 years to see how do we actually mobilize resources and make sure that we are meeting or at least highly aware of the needs on the ground so that we can advocate for funding and programs and support to our communities. So this wheel shows us the state's drought response plan is really 3 different phases. We're always in phase 1, that frequent monitoring. And then back in last summer, so in June of 2020, we moved into phase 2, and that's after we pulled together the Drought Task Force, which is a group of directors from across the state that I was updating on our conditions and basically recommending to the Drought Task Force of activating our plan. So going into a higher state of response. This also activated, the phase 2 also activated an agricultural impact task force. And when we moved into phase 3 in December of 2020, we also activated a municipal drought task force. And all of those are shown here. So the sections of this network that are highlighted in blue is what's active right now. And that water availability task force, the climate update monthly, is always running regardless of drought status for the state. And then these other task forces, agricultural, energy, municipal water, and wildlife, can be activated as needed. We haven't actually ever historically activated the energy or wildlife task forces, but those are active in other ways, especially in response to wildfire. So there's lots of wildlife teams that are more responsive to where fires are at any given time. And we're in communication with those groups. So the agricultural municipal task forces have been our core teams that meet regularly, and they're representatives from across the state for different regions across the state, as well as different subsectors of those economies for ag and municipal water. And that's where we try to have our ear to the ground, so to speak, and hearing where issues and concerns are really bubbling up so that we can direct attention, not just as a state, but as a task force to help each other. So you might have one municipality who's never dealt with a kind of shortage that another municipality has. And because of this network, we can make sure that we are providing, that community with support, whether it's, communication examples of how to talk about drought, whether it's response plans if they don't have their own. And then for agriculture, it's a lot of making sure people have access to federal and state funding and relief support for the impacts, because that community we know is really the front lines of drought, and that they feel the impacts first because they're working with the landscape, and they're actually more like our canaries. They say, hey, our fields are looking really bad this year, well before we even have our springtime streamflow reading. So in many ways, agricultural takes the brunt of drought, and after year 1 or year 2, we start to feel it more in our other economies, like municipal water management and recreation and tourism. Let's see. So to talk about both impacts and solutions, we recently hosted a Northwest Drought Tour. This was hosted by the Drought Task Force, but really was only possible through the partnership of all of our local water leaders. This was based out of Steamboat, and it was just on August 11th and 12th. And we brought in decision makers from around the state. So that's representatives. There were federal representatives, state representatives, and many other director level leaders from across the state to the Northwest region. And we did a 1.5-day bus tour where every single stop, I think, I don't have the total, but I think it was about 15 or 20, 15 stops where we had local leaders that are making those hard decisions in their own economies and communities on how to manage from day to day. They were the focus of this tour, and they were educating our decision makers on both the challenges and opportunities that they see. So there was a lot of good press around this, and we even had the governor there for the first day. But really the focus that I've strongly been advocating for in this role is to highlight solutions, decisions, where support can be really effective, because it's almost like we're past having to talk about the impacts. It's not just convincing people that this is a challenge. It's almost like we're on the same page at this point. This is very challenging, and the directionality, it is getting very clear. So trying to highlight where communities are getting creative around solutions and partnerships was a big focus of this tour. I have some similar news clippings I won't get into because both Martin and Kerry covered these. But the last thing I'll close with is we have several resources to help share just like language and verbiage and information around how Colorado experiences drought. And there's a collection of resources there on the CWC page. That's the first link. We also had the Ag Task Force prepare this 2-pager for the legislature this past year that highlights recommended actions, what we can do, some summaries about economic impacts. And this was a very informational piece, but it also informed 2 major bills that brought funding to drought resilience grants this year. So the work of these task forces it's not explicit exactly what they should do. The point is to make sure that we are just like involved in influencing decisions around funding and support, so that we can continue to highlight drought as really our entire state and the entire West's challenge for the foreseeable future. We also have, this is you can go to this short link, but this highlights incredible first-person stories from our agricultural communities from 2020. We have a news feed there that you can flip through different stories that highlight both impacts and solutions, as well as have some summaries around what the experience of our agricultural communities are and the understanding of where we're at. So I know I covered a lot in a short time and want to make sure not to put us behind, but are there any questions I can take now or?
Yes, great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate that presentation. That was awesome. The first question that we have for you is from Elise Osenga, and she says, Megan, considering that drought has lingering impacts and drought projections, how can we keep drought/impacts present in community mind and public actions during wet years?
Mm-hmm.
How do we foster an ethic and practice of considering water as a precious resource in the West? Oh, whoops, sorry. It went away there for a second. Oh boy. As a precious resource in the West, even in high precipitation years.
Beautifully worded question. And that is certainly something we think about a lot. I think this will continue to be a challenge. The mindset of, oh, well, when you have, sorry, I have a very annoying fly. If you see me swatting, that is what's happening. So this will continue to be a challenge, right? When even this year, when the Front Range had far more moisture than the West Slope, there are challenges about communicating, well, this is really the condition of the entire state, and our Front Range communities rely on Western Slope water. So it's not just, oh, my yard had rain and I'm good to go. This really is a long-term conversation. And I think when we have years like this year, where the entire Western US is in this really dire state, and we have wildfires on top of wildfires, and neighboring states. It's not just, you know, one small portion of Colorado. We're talking about the entire Western US in unprecedented conditions. It makes that conversation easier because it's not so localized anymore. And so we need to continue to talk about past drought years, and in the, you know, we kind of refer to them as, oh, the 2002 drought and the, you know, 2018, and they all have a little bit of their own lessons learned, but we're increasingly seeing that these are broader scale drought cycles. And there's not a clear-cut answer to that question, except for really incorporating the understanding of, you know, the direction that we're going with water shortages for our states and even neighboring states that are facing actual federal cuts around planning, because it's not if, and, you know, if this happens, it's just when does it hit me? So talking about personal stories is really important, which is why that Colorado Drought Report, we focused on first person stories, because until neighbors hear their neighbors talking about, you know, I've worked this ranch for 5 generations. We heard people on the Northwest Drought Tour say they've never once in 5 generations had to haul water, and that's what they've relied on all year. Stories like that are meaningful within communities. And so telling personal stories is really essential to run home with the, oh, this is not an anomaly.
Great. And that actually leads really well into one more quick question, if we can do that before we move on. And this is from Julie Vano. She says, Megan, are the innovations for how communities are adapting, similar to what you had seen on the Northwest Drought Tour, captured somewhere so that others can learn from them too? And so I think that this kind of touches into one of the links that you shared, but that's a great question.
That is a great question, and certainly something we want to focus on as we start creating more reports of what the lessons learned and experiences from this particular you know, drought year, whether we're for 2 years or 3 years, whatever we're in right now. It's hard to report on those impacts and innovations like in real time, but we have many methods for doing that. So the Colorado Water Plan, which we're in the process of updating right now, will be released at the end of next year. That's the first update to the water plan, and there will be highlights of stories and innovations for that purpose. This is also, it does, what I was mentioning does lead into this, because this is where sharing stories locally is really important, so we can push media to tell these stories, so we can get a broader audience than just water communities, right? If we can say, like, if like as a group of community members, we say, whoa, what they did was really interesting, like, ask the media to cover it. And they increasingly will. I don't think I've ever seen so many drought stories as this year, nationally and locally. And so we need to push people to cover these stories so that we can hear what kind of decisions and creativity, you know, people are taking on to address this.
Great. Thank you so much, Megan,
Sure.
for your wonderful presentation and comments here. And we'll look forward to bringing you back for the Q&A. It is now my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Josh German. Josh is a program analyst for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. He has worked for the Watersmart Resources and Planning Office for over 10 years. And he coordinates the Watersmart grants for the Bureau of Reclamation. Josh received his Bachelor of Arts from Colby College and an LLM degree in environmental law from the University of Denver. Josh, welcome. It's our sincere pleasure to have you here today, and thank you so much for presenting.
Hi, Maddie. Good morning. Did I get the slide up there okay?
Yes, it does look good. I think it might be in presenter
I got the
mode.
wrong mode, yeah. You'd think after a year and a half of doing this, I would have figured that out by now, but apparently not. Well,
I think if you go into the display settings at the top, it might be in there. So right next to the show taskbar, there's the display settings. Sorry. So I think to the right.
I'm going to figure that out. So I guess you'll just have to bear with me here. I don't think I have any notes in this presentation anyhow. You'll have a little preview of what's to come here in the next slide. Good morning, everybody, and really thank you so much for having me here today. It's a really extraordinary event that you all are putting on, and I'm really quite honored to be presenting here. So thank you for that. My family and I, we actually live here in Steamboat, so it hits close to home from a personal perspective as well as professional. And there was a question earlier about why we should have hope in these dark, smoky times, and I certainly would say that events like this and hearing some of the programs that CMC is offering, those are reasons, I think, for hope as well. So again, thank you for organizing here today. My name is Josh German. I am in the Water Resources and Planning Office at the Bureau of Reclamation. I am going to talk with you here this morning just quickly about the Watersmart program. It is federal response, part of a federal response to a lot of the issues that we've heard discussed here already this morning. Before diving into Watersmart, I just want to give a quick background update on what Reclamation is for those not familiar. Reclamation is a water management agency within the Department of the Interior. It exists in the 17 Western states, territories, eligible territories, and Alaska and Hawaii in some cases. But as you can see here, Reclamation has a really large footprint across the West, both in terms of water and power. It's the largest wholesale water supplier in the nation, as well as the second largest producer of hydroelectric power. You can see some of the other statistics here on just the extent to which Reclamation is engaged and involved in water and power in the West. So just a quick intro to Reclamation for those who might not otherwise be familiar. Onto the Watersmart program. So what is Watersmart? This is a Department of the Interior initiative. It started in 2010, really with the intent to support stakeholders, develop solutions to a lot of these problems that we've heard addressed today, particularly related to water supply. We've got population growth, climate change, drought. There are aging infrastructure concerns, restoration needs. So Watersmart is intended to provide support, usually in the form of financial support, to local stakeholders to undertake work to address these problems, which again, as we've heard, are extensive. We've heard and we've experienced are quite extensive throughout the West. What is Watersmart more specifically? So Watersmart is an umbrella initiative. There are a host of programs that fall within the Watersmart umbrella, as you can see here, and in, I guess, true bureaucratic way. Each of these programs has sub-programs within them. I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these individually in the next few slides, just to give you a sense of the array of different types of funding opportunities and programs that are available through the Watersmart program. But in terms of some of the basics, just very high level particulars about the program, most of these are grant programs. There is funding that's allocated through competitive processes on an annual basis. Typically, there's a 50% non-federal cost share that is required. Eligible applicants are typically include states, tribes, irrigation districts, municipalities, pretty much entities with water or power delivery authority. One of the things that was recently amended in the Secure Water Act back in December, the Secure Water Act is the authority for many of these programs. It added, in some cases, nonprofit conservation entities. I think the real takeaway here is if any of these are of interest, it's going to be prudent to take a look at the individual program, individual funding opportunity for the specific requirements of each. But in general, again, grant programs, 50% non-federal cost share. Those are some of the general basic requirements with some variation from program to program. So to go through these quickly here, first up is the Basin Study Program. As you can see, collaborative planning. These are studies undertaken with partners across the West to evaluate water supply and demand at the basin level, to help ensure that water supplies are available, to identify strategies to address imbalances in water supply and demand, and really prepare for the future. Title 16 is the Water Reclamation and Reuse Program. Title 16 includes funding for planning, design, and construction of recycling and reuse projects. WaterSmart grants. This is for on-the-ground water conservation, mostly water conservation improvement projects. There are some other details there I'll get into in the next slide about WaterSmart grants. The Water Conservation Field Services is a little unique in that it is run out of the regional offices. Reclamation is divided into 5 different regions. This program is managed out of the regions. It's the one program that is not managed out of our office, which is based in Denver. There's funding available under field services for water conservation planning and design activities. Drought Response Program, again, I'll touch on this one in a little more detail in a subsequent slide, but there's funding available for drought planning as well as drought resiliency projects. And then lastly, the final program within WaterSmart is going to be the Cooperative Watershed Management Program, watershed management and restoration activities. And again, I will talk to that one a little more directly here in a few slides. I do want to just talk, oops, going the wrong way, there we go. I do want to talk a little bit about each of these programs that I think are going to be most relevant. So I've excluded the Basin Study Program and the Title 16 program and the Field Services Program, in part because I'm not sure how relevant they are for this discussion. And also I'm not as familiar with those as I am with some of these other ones. There's a whole list of contacts at the end of the presentation. So if anything is of interest, you want more information, there's contacts available. I have a whole slide about different resources on the website to learn more about any of these programs. But quickly, because I know time is a consideration here, there are 3 categories of funding within WaterSmart grants, the largest being the Water and Energy Efficiency Grant. Things like canal lining and piping, advanced metering in the municipal setting, projects that are going to conserve water is really the focus there. Small scale is just a smaller version of that Water and Energy Efficiency Grant, smaller dollars, smaller projects, a little easier to get selected. And then there's also an opportunity for entities to undertake water marketing strategy, to participate in water marketing strategy grants, to develop or plan for a water market between willing buyers and sellers. So that's the WaterSmart grants program and the 3 sub activities that fall within it: drought, response program, obviously very relevant for our discussion here today. There is funding available again for drought contingency planning. Entities can develop, update a comprehensive drought plan through the drought contingency planning funding opportunity. And then drought resiliency projects, there's funding available for on the ground work to address drought resiliency, things like new conveyance system components, water storage, recharge, et cetera. The emergency response actions are much more limited. It's not an annual funding opportunity that's based on a state declaration of drought, and that is something that's sort of its own separate piece, but it is within the drought response program. So just want to point out that there is that aspect to it as well. Something new this fiscal year is the environmental water resources projects. I mentioned earlier there were some amendments to the Secure Water Act. This comes out of those amendments back in December. The main focus of this new funding opportunity is going to be on benefits to ecological values. That's really the focus here. It is not within one of the programs I mentioned previously. It's its own standalone. It's a bit of a hybrid between a few of the different programs. So as of now, it's just a standalone, but the focus is going to be on impacts and benefits to ecological values. The one real thing to point out here is the exception to the 50% cost share. It's only a 25% cost share, non-federal cost share that's going to be required as part of this environmental water resources funding opportunity, assuming that the project and the goals of that funding opportunity. Real quick, the last couple of programs, there is funding available under the Cooperative Watershed Management Program to develop a watershed group or to conduct watershed planning. There's no cost share required to participate in phase 1 of the Cooperative Watershed Management Program. Again, you can see here some of the activities that are going to be eligible for funding under that Cooperative Watershed Management Program. Last but not least, I just want to mention there is also a funding opportunity for applied science grants. These really are focused on tools and information modeling, forecasting, those types of efforts. And so I thought that would be another one that was worth mentioning to the group here this morning. I know I'm going through these really quickly. One thing that's relevant is going to be the funding available for these different programs. Each of these are their own individual line items in the budget. You can see the FY21 budget request was for just shy of $16 million, and 21 actual appropriations were almost 10 times that at about $150 million. So there's quite a bit of funding available under the program, particularly when you think about the fact that Reclamation as a whole has an annual budget around $1 billion. The Watersmart program gets a decent amount of funding to undertake these various program activities. We don't have funding appropriations yet for FY 2022. You can see here the President's budget request. We're hoping that we'll have funding in excess of that amount. One other thing to keep an eye out for is the infrastructure bill. There may be some significant funding available for our programs as part of that infrastructure bill, assuming that that goes through. It's a whole suite of programs. I think the main takeaway really is there are a lot of different opportunities here within Watersmart. For those that are interested in pursuing any of these sources of funding, there's a lot of information available on the website. We are always available to talk about specific projects. There are past webinars, recent webinars just from the last few weeks that are posted on the website. There are links on the website where you can book time to talk with us directly based on the program that you're interested in. So, in terms of accessing these grant opportunities and accessing the program coordinators and staff in our office, we are really readily available to talk about particular projects or to just give more information or background on particular programs. You can sign up as well here for a listserv where you'll get periodic updates when there's a new funding opportunity announcement posted, things like that. The last piece I wanted to talk about here, just very quickly, point out some of the tools on the website. Marty had actually pointed out there's a bunch of information on the website earlier with regard to Lake Powell. We've got some specific Watersmart information here. There's an interactive tool on the website. You can look through all the different projects that have been funded through Watersmart. You can narrow in, you can get specific project information, you can filter by state, things like that. So that's a neat tool that's available on the website. And then just very recently, we launched a Drought Portal. It's really to address all things drought, provide tools, go over current drought conditions. And again, that's on the website, and that is new within the last few weeks or a month or so. Here's the contact information for the various programs. It's a lot to cover. I hope that it wasn't too much of an overload, but thank you for letting me talk a little bit about the Watersmart program and maybe introducing the program to a lot of you who may otherwise have not been familiar. So I will stop there and see if there are any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Josh. We do have a quick question for you, and then we'll move on to the broader Q&A portion with all of the panelists. Tony asked, Josh, would some of these grants be available to replace golf course green lawns around our area, say with xeriscape, non-irrigated or low irrigation plantings and hardscape cover?
I think the short answer is probably. Yeah, we evaluate these types of projects case by case, but we have done plenty of work with removing water intensive grasses and replacing with xeriscape. That's something we've seen. Typically, we've seen it in the municipal setting where entities are providing rebates for folks to remove grass in their yards and put in more efficient landscaping. But I don't know why that wouldn't apply to the golf course setting. You just have to consider who the eligible applicant is going to be and make sure you're hitting the other eligibility requirements. But that's exactly the type of thing. If you want to reach out directly, we can talk more specifically about the project and the details and provide as much guidance as we can as you're contemplating whether or not to apply and which program to apply to.
Great, thank you so much. If anyone has more questions for Josh, please put them in the chat. And now it is my pleasure to bring up all of our panelists, Megan, Josh, and Marty. And we are going to open it up for the panel Q&A portion of this webinar. So again, just please use the chat to put your questions in. I'm going to address a few that have already been asked. And if you would like to raise your hand, we will unmute you and you can actually come up on screen and ask someone your question live. So with that, I will start us out with a question for Marty. Julie Vano says, Marty, I love how this rendezvous has grown. What is your vision for the next 5+ years from now? Open, Marty, I think you're on mute, sorry.
First person to ever do that, I know. So Julie, thanks for the comment, and it's been a really fun effort. It's a lot of opportunity for this in the future, I think. To me, YBR creates a venue or opportunity to bring together experts, in science and engineering disciplines, but also leaders in the community and members of the public and the broader communities that are involved in the area or are impacted by it. And if this can help establish a foundation of shared awareness, mutual respect, even lasting relationships, there may be a few common sense actionable goals that can come out. And we're starting to see a little bit of that. Ideally, it can create opportunities for individuals interested in the technical disciplines, internships, undergraduate, graduate degrees, maybe ultimately filling jobs that emerge that require people trained or cross-trained in these areas. And then ideally, in the long run, I think if the Yampa Basin over the next 5 to 10 years could become, could serve as an example from its natural systems to its communities and economy of bringing science, engineering, and society together to tackle these problems in the 21st century on water, I think that'd be an incredible contribution, and hopefully the Rendezvous will be evolve over time in a way that helps achieve those things. I think it's got potential. It's a lot of fun, and this presentations we just had are just very telling of how impactful this has already gotten to be. So, thank you.
Great, thank you, Marty. The next question is, are there any specific programs or efforts targeting green water storage in the form of increased soil water retention? So I'm not sure if Megan or Josh, if you want to address that, or Marty, if you have anything there.
Could you ask the question? Go ahead, Megan.
I don't know of explicit programs, but the first thing that comes to mind with this question is another task force called the Natural and Working Lands Task Force, which was really born from U.S. Climate Alliance initiative to focus on adapting our natural and working lands, which encompasses far more than agriculture. That's, any natural working lands would be forests, kind of Bureau of Land Management territory, and really trying to bring in regenerative and restorative land practices, which would has the big picture of trying to make sure that those systems are, healthy, or at least not degrading so quickly that we're losing both carbon and the health that actually retains soil moisture. So when you have desert landscapes, right, aridification is the increase of arid environments, and when you have unhealthy ecosystems, there's not enough plant or just life generally that actually helps retain water in our landscapes. And so that is a pretty young group that started last year, and we're just now working on a plan for what areas of the state that task force is going to focus on supporting, but it has a vision of making sure that we have some sort of carbon accounting and program for the state that also focuses on soil health. So there is also a soil health program at the Colorado Department of Agriculture that just, I think, hired a new person in the last few months to run that program. So also young and don't have a lot of details there, but definitely increasing attention on soil health.
Maddie, could you reread the question briefly?
Yes. Are there any specific programs or efforts targeting green water storage in the form of increased soil water retention?
I don't know of any programs to increase green water storage, but it would be nice if we could measure how much water is stored in the soil, because that seems like a key thing. I really liked Megan's comment there about the soil deficit or soil moisture deficit. Was that the phrase, Megan? And the sponge analogy. And imagine, we're all living on our watershed, lives on a sponge, and we have no idea really, or very little idea of how much water is in that sponge, when the spring runoff starts. That's pretty much the situation we're in. There are a few exceptions, but we're way short on what's needed there.
Great, thank you. And Josh, did you have any input on that question?
Yeah, I was going to say that'd be something new within our programs, but then again, we have this new funding opportunity this year. We've been getting a lot of inquiries about different types of projects that we haven't necessarily seen before. I'm not sure that this is the type of on-the-ground improvement that would fit, but I guess what I would say is it's always helpful to reach out to one of us, and if it doesn't fit within one program, we kick it around with the other folks in our group and see if there is a place for it. And at the end of the day, even if there's not, at least it gives us an idea of what there is demand for. And those are things that we can consider adapting the programs to in the future. If all of a sudden we get a whole bunch of inquiries about a similar type of project that is maybe not something we've previously considered, that we do have the ability to update these funding opportunities year after year.
Great, thank you. This next question is for all of you. It's from Nathan Stewart. He said, how does, say, AR data, Marty, find its way to federal, Josh, and state, Megan, funding to funding allocation and policy making, essentially coordination between all of you?
I can speak a little bit to that. And then forming up the center at Scripps Oceanography at UC San Diego, one of the goals was to establish connections and appropriate capacities to the mission of key federal agencies and state agencies, and as well as local agencies. And we've been able to bring them together around the concept of scientific studies and new observations and new tools to support water decisions in the West in a way that's been working pretty well. So I would certainly welcome the chance, to talk with Josh and Megan a bit about that experience and learn from them a bit as well.
Hey, Megan and Josh, do you have any input on that?
Yeah, I don't have a ton there other than, again, reaching out and connecting and, sharing what the mutual interests and connections are. And, that really being the first step. At some point, it's been many years now, we did have a clearinghouse set up on our website where it was possible to populate data from all these different sources, but that has not been active for a little while. So I think at this point, the best thing is to just reach out and connect.
Great, thank you so much. Sorry.
Yeah, and I would also say to Marty's point, one of the really great things about this type of meeting is the connections that it's already established in an hour and a half time. So yeah, kudos.
Sorry, I have a little bit of a struggle between my two computers here and finding the mute button. So apologies for that. And AR, I'm sorry if that was confusing for anyone. AR data is atmospheric river data. So apologies for any confusion there with the lingo. And so our next question is, why is the government subsidizing irrigation of crops in the desert like dairy, alfalfa, cotton, etc.? So I'm not sure if anyone is ready to address that one. And if not, we can move on.
Well, I mean, it feels like that might be geared toward the programs that we manage. I'm not sure that I would put it as in subsidizing crops. The programs are open to eligible entities across the West, and a project that is going to save water in one respect is, has its own benefits, and a project that saves water in another area might have a different set of benefits. At the end of the day, they're both trying to conserve water. And so the Watersmart program in general is really focused on these suite of projects with the main goal of enhancing water supply reliability, and that that occurs in all aspects of life in the West here.
Yeah, I'll also jump in on that, which I don't have a specific answer to this question, but I think it might illuminate kind of the challenge here, which is, in drought response and supporting our agricultural communities before, during, and after drought, I have learned very quickly about federal agriculture policy, which really has historically developed without a specific attention to Western agriculture, right? A large contingent of voices that have developed agricultural policies are in the interest of Eastern agriculture because that is how our country grew. And so it just so happens that a lot of those policies don't take into account the unique situations that we have here in the West. And we're really coming to see, even with like financial support after disasters, there's some crops that we grow in Colorado that aren't even included in the what qualifies for insurance and other things. So there is also a disconnect between how those policies have been developed in the strongest, loudest, largest contingent of voices that developed those policies, and Western agriculture being not as prominent in the origination, if that makes sense. So we're really seeing that come to head now, and the reason for adapting those policies nationally are because things work differently out West, and we should be prioritizing different crops, and that's not where money started flowing towards, just because of how those programs came about.
And Megan, if I could just pile on that, your story about the ag support in that way, emerging the way it has, is very analogous to what's happened in meteorology, where we all know how important hurricanes and nor'easters and tornadoes and severe storms in the Great Plains are. The Western water issues had traditionally not received as much attention. I think that's starting to change a bit. And of course, the water crises in the West and the fires are bringing more attention to that. But yeah, those are very big structural, sort of deeply embedded things in our nation's policies. And really appreciate hearing your perspective on the ag side. I had no idea about that.
Great. And this actually leads very well into our next question. Dina Evans says, thank you for the wonderful discussion. Are there agencies specifically considering impacts and potential ways to address issues for food production in the West? And I'm not sure if Josh or Megan, you want to address this one, if you have any input here. And I can repeat it as well too.
Yeah, well, go ahead, Megan, sorry.
No, go for it. I'll be back on you.
No, again, I was just going to sort of reiterate earlier, these funding opportunities are open to the list of eligible entities in the Western 17 states, including irrigation districts. And it's not, the focus is not on food supply necessarily, but when these local stakeholders are developing projects that are going to save water, there are certainly other benefits. And if that happens to trickle down to the food supply, then that might be the case. But there's nothing specifically that we have within the WaterSmart program, nothing that I'm familiar with. I suppose there might be something on the USDA, NRCS side of things that's more specific to that, but nothing within our purview.
And the only thing I'll add is I'm not as familiar with Colorado Mountain College programs, but I did just recently get involved with CSU's Interfuse program, which is Food, Energy, Water Nexus study for grad students. And I'm curious, and might punt that back to the college question of do we see programs like Food, Energy, Water Nexus spanning those industries and topics? Do we see that emerging in interest with students, and are we beginning to prioritize some of that integrated coursework or cross industry focus? Because that's where food production, water management, when we start talking about those things together, that's where we really have some growth. And I'd be interested to hear if our colleges are putting more attention to that.
Great, thank you so much. This question, the next one, is to all panelists. Patrick Stabe says, what opportunities do you envision for Western water policy reform? The Colorado Interstate Stream Compact, for example, Is there a possibility to engage broad stakeholders and reconfigure how water is used, delivered, and stored? If so, who might the drought spur this on? So there's a lot there to unpack.
I feel like that would go directly to my agency, but I am not the right person to answer that question. So it is also, we should have a legal person answering this question, but there is upcoming a renegotiation of the Colorado River Compact. Not sure if that's what Patrick, you meant, but there's certainly ongoing conversations between Western state leaders around how to, I don't know if you'd call it, I mean, it is reform of the conditions in which we currently manage the Colorado River are being renegotiated to really incorporate the reality of where we are in long-term trends. I know there's a lot of questions in there. Is there a possibility to engage broad stakeholders and reconfigure? There are constantly opportunities to engage as a stakeholder in water management conversations, and I'll just highlight a few. If you're not familiar with the Colorado Basin roundtables, I refer to those as essentially water town hall meetings. Those are public meetings. There are roundtables, so those are stakeholder groups open to anyone. There are members who are elected onto those roundtables, and they represent entire basins. So there is a Yampa white-green roundtable, and that group meets regularly to inform water policy at the state. So it developed in really like 2000s and has grown into one of the most robust examples of stakeholder engagement and state policy that I personally know. And there is an opportunity there to engage. If you are interested in affecting water policy, that is a beautiful place to start. Thanks, Michelle. And also, there are people who have been involved in those roundtables for a long time that are really excited for new people to come in. It's not only old hats and you're not welcome here. I think the culture of those roundtables are really shifting and realizing the more people involved, the stronger our state policies are going to be, because the Colorado Water Conservation Board sees those roundtables as the essential voices. It is not an afterthought. They actually guide the direction of our board in every way. So please do start there. Also, it's a good way to just meet people in an industry if you're interested.
Great. Marty,
If I could,
go ahead.
I had, this is a very wonky side of things, so bear with me for a moment, but a reservoir, I work with the Corps of Engineers a fair bit, and their reservoirs, and they have hundreds of them across the country. And I know the Bureau is the primary for this region, but this example applies to the Bureau at some level, I'm sure, as well. Each reservoir has a what's called a water control manual, and it is the rules by which that reservoir is operated. And traditionally, when the dams were built, these rules were created as part of the construction of the dam, so that they know how to operate it when they were built or after it was done. And it says basically water on the ground, how much snow in the basin, how much water in the reservoir, how much water in the stream. And those feed into what's called a rule curve that informs the operator of the dam how much water to release each day. And that rule curve is very, firm, because if it's not followed and there's a flood downstream, that creates problems, or other problems can occur. So those rule curves, there's a lot of action in that, and it's owned by it's part of what's called the Water Control Manual. Well, interestingly, because when most of the dams were built, forecasting of weather, in particular precipitation, was primitive and highly unreliable. So there was no forecast information allowed to be used by the operators. We've advanced a lot in meteorology in the last decades, and I've initiated a project called Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations, FIRO, pronounced FIRO, And we've been working for 7 years now with the Corps of Engineers, and we've demonstrated in some situations where the forecast skill for these atmospheric river storms on the West Coast, at least, is adequate to allow a reservoir operator to operate a bit differently in a way that increases their ability to retain water after a storm. If there's no new storm coming, they don't need to release that extra water, or to release extra water before a big storm to help increase flood control. That flexibility is now being codified in updates to water control manuals. And it is just beginning. We've got a pilot study that's completed. It increased the water supply reliability from this important dam by 20% during the third driest year on record. And now we're working on with other dams to do the same thing. So this is a water policy thing, and changes in it are being proposed based on scientific study around predicting precipitation better. So basically everybody's in favor politically of knowing more what's going to come from the atmosphere in terms of rain. It's when it gets on the ground, people start having different uses for it and everything, and that can create some challenges. But the idea is that better prediction of precipitation can help enable forecast-informed reservoir operations, which can lead to greater flexibility in operating existing reservoirs. Now, I said that as it's just really at the beginning, and it's been a several year effort to do this really rigorously with the reservoirs we're working on now. So it's not something that can just flip a switch and all of a sudden it's going to be applied to your reservoir or your region. But in principle, this finding is now being, we're developing a way to explore its applicability across the rest of the country, including the Western Slope here. And we're doing that with the Army Corps of Engineers. Congress is asking us to do that. And we've been briefing the Energy and Water Subcommittee on this, and they're very proactive and supportive. So I'm very hopeful that we are actually turning a corner for some very wonky element of the water policy structure that we all depend upon that most of us don't even know exists. So I'll end with that.
Great, thank you so much. I am going to end us here. We have gone over time, so I want to be respectful of that for everyone. And I want to say thank you so much to Marty, Josh, and Megan, and JC and Kerry for opening us up today in our first panel here. It was a wonderful discussion, and for all of the questions that we weren't able to get to, we asked the panelists to address them in the chat if you're available to do so. And if not, we'll follow up after via email for those questions. We're very much looking forward to our next panel, which will start after a brief intermission at 11 a.m. So just in a couple of moments. And we'll thank you so much and look forward to that next panel, which is the latest drought science with the presenters there. And so thank you so much, everyone. And we'll now go into a brief intermission. Thanks.
Thank you. See you shortly.